The thin, persistent drizzle of New York fell like a veil over Greenwood Cemetery, silencing the distant urban roar and gluing wet, brown leaves to the stone pathways. For Arthur, the biting cold slicing through his expensive dark suit was an old acquaintance, a faithful companion on his weekly pilgrimage. For exactly 365 days, he had walked this same path, carrying a rare bouquet of hybrid roses and a silence that weighed more heavily than his vast portfolio. Every step between the cold headstones was a deliberate descent into the pain that he, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his firm and fortune, could not dominate. Guilt was an implacable creditor, and Arthur came to pay his debt with religious punctuality. The mausoleum of Clara, his only daughter, was an altar of immaculate white marble where he deposited his flowers and silent prayers, attempting to negotiate a forgiveness that never arrived. The accident, as the press reported with surgical detachment, had been swift, a flicker that extinguished the brightest light of his life. He paid for the best funeral, the most elegant headstone, the efficiency of a process that sealed everything too quickly. He bought the silence to avoid hearing the details, but that silence had become his executioner. That evening, however, something shattered the sacred routine. His steps, usually firm and decisive, stalled a few feet from his destination. Kneeling before Clara's marble tomb was a young girl, small, in a simple dress with hair tied in a loose braid. She did not seem to belong in this landscape of wealth and contained grief. In her small hands, there were no imported roses, but a handful of white daisies, likely picked from some modest garden. With a delicate gesture, she placed them at the base of the marble, and Arthur could hear, carried on the damp breeze, a whisper that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Thank you, my star." The voice was a bell, fragile and full of a disarming childish sincerity. But it wasn't the voice that paralyzed him. It was the face. When the girl turned slightly, the profile revealed was a painful copy, an impossible mirror of the past. The same dimple that formed at the corner of her left smile, the same curious tilt of the head when observing something, the same brightness in the large, brown eyes. It was Clara, yet it was not. It was a ghost in flesh and blood. Arthur's heart, a muscle trained for the fluctuations of the stock market and million-dollar deals, skipped a beat. He, a man whose wealth was measured in digits most people couldn't count, suddenly felt poor, stripped of any defense. Instinct propelled him forward, a magnetic force drawing him toward that unbelievable vision. He needed to see up close, to confirm that his eyes, weary from mourning, were not deceiving him. The girl didn't seem to notice him, focused on her small ritual of gratitude. Up close, the resemblance was even more disturbing, almost cruel. He stopped beside her, the shadow of his imposing body covering the small figure. That's when he saw it. The girl's dress, slightly worn, had the collar open just enough to reveal a subtle, thin, whitish line at the base of her neck, just above her chest. A scar, discreet, nearly invisible, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. In that instant, a coldness that didn't come from the drizzle settled in his spine, an internal chill spreading a terrible, sharp doubt through every fiber of his being. A soft voice, tinged with concern, broke Arthur's trance. "Sir, is everything all right?" He turned slowly, his body stiff as stone. Standing a respectful distance away, holding a simple umbrella, was a woman with tired but gentle features. She was the girl's mother, he presumed, the guardian of the small phantom who had just turned his world upside down. The girl, whom he now mentally named Sophia, ran to the woman's side, clinging to her skirt with a confidence that spoke of a deep, secure love. Arthur tried to find his voice. The same voice that commanded boardrooms and closed multi-million-dollar deals, but what came out was a raspy sound, almost a whisper. The scar was all he managed, pointing with a restrained gesture. The woman, whose name he would discover was Helena, looked at her daughter and then at him, her gaze mixing shyness with protective pride. "Oh, yes. That's the mark of her new life," she explained, her voice low so as not to disturb the cemetery's peace. Sophia received a new heart, a blessing. It happened exactly 1 year ago, on the very day that the young woman in this tomb passed away. The word coincidence was insufficient. It was an offense to the magnitude of what he felt. The air seemed to grow denser, harder to breathe, Helena continued, as if needing to justify their presence. Ever since she recovered, she asks to come here. She says she needs to thank the star that gave her a new beat for her chest. I believe deep down she feels the connection. Children know things. Arthur merely nodded, unable to formulate a coherent reply. He thanked Helena with a nod and stepped away, leaving the roses on the tombstone without completing his ritual of silence. The walk back to his luxury sedan was a blur. Inside the vehicle, with the scent of leather and the soundproofing that sealed him off from the world, he tried to cling to rationality. He was a man of numbers, of logic, of calculated investments. Resemblances happened, stories crossed paths, but the image of that scar, that dimple, that way of tilting her head, that was not data on a spreadsheet. It was a splinter lodged in his soul. Arriving at his penthouse, with the view of Manhattan spread out at his feet like a carpet of indifferent lights, solitude assaulted him with brutal force. All that wealth, all that accumulated capital, seemed like dust. He picked up the phone and called an old contact, the director of one of the hospitals where his foundation made generous donations. He spoke with his usual calm voice, requesting a discreet favor, a consultation of old records, citing a research project for the foundation. He revealed nothing, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. The answer came 2 hours later, and it was more disturbing than he could have imagined. "Arthur, this is strange," the director said. "The records from that day, specifically the pediatric transplant wing, have gaps. Signatures are missing. Pages seem to have been inserted later. The attending physician who signed the child's discharge was transferred upstate the following week, an atypical move. And there's more. One of the night shift nurses, a woman named Beatrice, resigned without notice and simply vanished. Every word was a nail in a coffin he thought was sealed. In that moment, the memory of Clara's funeral returned with terrifying clarity. The rush, the lawyers handling everything, the casket they insisted was better left closed. For the first time, he realized he hadn't just paid for efficiency. He had paid for silence. A silence that now screamed, and the name echoing in that scream was Beatrice. The night was a long vigil. Arthur, the man whose business empire was built on the ability to anticipate the market and sleep soundly while his assets multiplied, couldn't close his eyes. The image of Sophia's scar and the name of the missing nurse, Beatrice, danced in his mind like specters. Control, the certainty that had always been the pillars of his existence, had dissolved into powder. His immense fortune, capable of moving mountains in the financial world, seemed impotent to quell the storm brewing inside him. Passive grief transformed into a burning obsession, a visceral need to unearth a truth he feared but could no longer ignore. By morning, the decision was made. He could no longer rely on digital records or favors from directors. He needed an eyewitness, someone who was there in the chaos of that terrible day. He needed to find the paramedic, using his network of contacts, a web of influence woven with years of strategic investments and quiet power. The task was surprisingly fast. In less than 24 hours, he had a name, Jonah, and an address. The meeting was arranged at a modest diner in Astoria, Queens, a world away from the luxury restaurants Arthur frequented. The smell of strong coffee and fresh bagels hung in the air, a stark contrast to the tension that settled at the small plastic table. Jonah was a middle-aged man with wide shoulders and the tired eyes of someone who had seen more suffering than he should. He was visibly uncomfortable, fiddling with his coffee cup with calloused hands, intimidated by the presence of the billionaire he only knew from magazine covers. Arthur skipped the preamble. He spoke in a low, controlled voice, not like a magnate, but like a father searching for answers. He offered the money not as a bribe, but as a guarantee that if Jonah lost his job for speaking, his family would not be left unprotected. "I don't want trouble, sir," Jonah said, without lifting his eyes. "I just did my job." Arthur leaned forward, and for the first time, his steel mask cracked, revealing the pain beneath. "Please, anything, a detail that wasn't in the report, something you saw." The sincere appeal broke Jonah's resistance. He took a deep breath and finally looked into Arthur's eyes. "It was strange," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "There was a lot of pressure to close the case right there on the road, orders from high up, and the movement at the hospital. It wasn't standard procedure. Your daughter's body was taken by a different team, not the morgues. A private, black-windowed car was waiting out back. They said it was a family request to avoid the press. I had never seen anything like it." Arthur's heart chilled. He'd made no such request. His lawyers handled everything. "Do you remember anything else? A name? A face?" Arthur insisted, feeling he was on the edge of an abyss. Jonah hesitated, searching his memory. "I heard one of the nurses. She was nervous, talking to a man who got out of the car. She mentioned a name, not of a person, but of a place. She said something like, 'The Genesis Institute protocol was followed.'" Arthur felt the floor disappear. Genesis. The Genesis Institute, a philanthropic fertility clinic, discreetly linked to a subsidiary of his conglomerate, a project he barely remembered approving, a place his ex-wife had frequented years ago in her desperate search for motherhood. The resemblance between the girls ceased to be a coincidence and became a dangerous and monstrous hypothesis. Jonah's revelation was a key that opened a door to a dark, unknown corridor. The Genesis Institute. The name echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of a past he preferred to forget, the frustrated attempts, his ex-wife's silent pain, the distance that grew between them. Immersed in his business and the expansion of his wealth, he had treated the situation as just another problem to be solved with money, signing checks for the best treatments without truly engaging. Now, that negligence was returning to haunt him. Arthur knew he couldn't storm the clinic with lawyers and accusations. It would create a scandal, alerting whoever was behind the gears and worst of all, putting Sophia under a cruel spotlight. He, the man who always bought the fastest solutions, made the rarest and most difficult decision of his life, to take the right path, however long and painful, and the right path started with Helena. He needed to speak to her, not as the multi-millionaire Arthur Drummond, but as a man who shared an invisible and inexplicable bond with her daughter. The next day, he dismissed his driver. He boarded a crowded subway for the first time in decades, the smell of fresh coffee and cheap perfume mingling with the sweat of a workday. The voices on the street, the laughter, the music leaking from an electronics store. It was a symphony of real life that his armored windows had always muffled. He found Helena's address on a simple street of brightly colored houses and low fences. She received him at the door, surprise and suspicion battling on her face. Arthur asked permission to enter with a humility he didn't know he possessed. Sitting on the modest but immaculately clean sofa, he told his story. He spoke of Clara, the tomb, the grief that brought him there every week. He didn't mention the clinic, the nurse, or his terrible suspicions. He simply shared his father's pain and the inexplicable resemblance that had shaken him. Helena listened in silence, her eyes fixed on him, realizing the truth in his trembling voice. When he finished, she took a deep breath and told her own story. "Sophia came to me as an emergency miracle," she said. "I had been on the adoption waiting list for years. One day, The agency called me. There was a newborn orphan who urgently needed a home. Her documents were incomplete. They said the biological mother had abandoned her at the hospital in critical condition. She arrived with a high fever, very frail. She paused, her eyes welling up. That very night she was rushed to the public hospital and underwent surgery. I just want her to be well, to grow up happy and far from fighting and confusion. Arthur felt a knot in his throat. The pieces were fitting together with terrifying precision. The emergency orphan, the operation on the same night. He looked at Helena, at the strength and unconditional love on her face, and knew what he had to say. I don't want to take anything from you. I need to understand. I promise to respect both of you. I promise I will do nothing to hurt her. It was a promise he knew was worth more than his entire fortune. A promise he would have to sustain with actions, not with checks. As he stood up to leave, his eyes fell upon a drawing held by a magnet on the refrigerator. It depicted two stick figures, two girls holding hands under a shooting star. Sophia made that, Helena said, smiling. She says it's her and her star sister. The conversation with Helena solidified two goals in Arthur's mind, goals that seemed almost insurmountable. The first was to uncover the truth, but to do so without desecrating Clara's grave with a public exhumation, without turning Sophia's life into a media spectacle. The second, and perhaps more difficult, was to protect the girl, ensuring her well-being without tearing her away from the woman who had raised her with genuine, palpable love. He knew he was stepping onto a minefield where every false step could detonate an emotional catastrophe for everyone involved. The promise he had made to Helena was not just a formality, it had become the moral compass of his journey. He, who had built an empire on hostile takeovers and aggressive strategies, now had to learn the art of subtlety and patience. Obstacles, however, appeared in a solid block, like an army determined to protect the status quo. His first attempt was through official channels. His lawyers discreetly contacted the public Metropolitan Medical Center, requesting the complete records of Clara's birth and Sophia's surgery. The response was a wall of bureaucracy. The institution shut down, citing HIPAA and internal non-disclosure protocols. The hospital that once bowed to his donations now treated him like an inconvenient stranger. His own family's reaction was even worse. When he shared a diluted version of his suspicions with his sister, Lydia, the guardian of the family reputation, the response was frigid. Arthur, you are going through complicated grief. This girl is an unfortunate coincidence. You are letting fantasies lead you. Think of the Drummond name, our father's legacy. An investigation like this, based on feelings, could destroy decades of work. His cousin, Richard too, a man whose ambition was as vast as the fortune he coveted, saw the situation as a golden opportunity. He called an emergency meeting with the conglomerate's attorneys, insinuating that Arthur's emotional state rendered him unfit to lead. He is unstable, Richard said, the concern in his voice sounding as phony as a $3 bill. We need to protect him from himself, and, more importantly, protect our assets from his impulsive decisions. Perhaps it's time to consider an incapacitation filing for the sake of the business. The threat hung in the air, cold and calculated. Arthur realized he wasn't just fighting a potential hospital conspiracy, but his own family, who saw his search for the truth as a direct threat to the wealth and image they prized so highly. No one wanted questions. Everyone wanted the official narrative, the tragic accident and silent pain to remain intact. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elvira, a discreet woman who had worked for the family for over 30 years and watched Clara grow up, observed everything with worried eyes. She saw Arthur's renewed pain, but also noticed a different spark in his gaze, a determination not driven by profit or power, but by something much deeper. In a gesture of silent loyalty, while organizing contacts in Arthur's address book, she discreetly jotted down his cell phone number on a slip of paper, And the next day, passing by the community daycare Sophia attended, handed it to the director. "Just in case of an emergency," she said simply. "I think he'd want to know." It was a small act of insubordination, a seed planted in uncertain ground that, little did she know, was about to blossom dramatically. The tension increased daily, transforming Arthur's luxurious penthouse into a golden cage. Richard's calls became more frequent, disguised as concern, but filled with leading questions about his meetings and state of mind. Lydia sent messages suggesting therapists and grief retreats, treating his pursuit of truth as a symptom of imbalance. The world he had always commanded now viewed him as a defective piece, a risk to the cash flow and stock profitability. He felt isolated, a general without an army, fighting a war no one else wanted fought. His only silent ally was Elvira, whose knowing glances and cups of tea, offered during moments of greatest anguish, were small beacons of humanity in an ocean of corporate coldness. The phone rang on a particularly grey afternoon, the jarring sound cutting through the heavy silence of the office. It wasn't Richard or Lydia. It was an unknown number. A nervous, hurried feminine voice introduced herself as the director of Sophia's community daycare. "Mr. Drummond, I apologize for the intrusion. Your housekeeper left your contact for emergencies. It's Sophia. She's not well. She has a very high fever, a bit disoriented. Her mother, Helena, works far away. The bus takes too long. I didn't know who else to call." Arthur's world stopped. The dividend spreadsheets, the stock market quotes, the threat of incapacitation all vanished. Only one thing mattered: Sophia. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice firm, the hesitation of recent days replaced by an overwhelming clarity of purpose. He sped toward the public hospital closest to the daycare, the same one where Helena had told him the girl was operated on. The pediatric emergency hallway was a chaos of crying, coughing, and anxious parents. Arthur, accustomed to the silent efficiency of private hospitals, felt like a fish out of water, but the smell of antiseptic and the sight of rushing nurses didn't intimidate him. He found Sophia in a small bed, her face flushed with fever, her eyes abnormally bright. Seeing him, a flash of recognition crossed her gaze, and she stretched her small hand toward him. "The man with the roses," she whispered, her voice weak. Arthur held her hand, feeling the warm, fragile skin. He faced the bureaucracy of admission, the curious stares of nurses who whispered as they recognized the billionaire in such an unusual environment. Without hesitation, he signed the liability waiver, ensuring that all costs, even there in the public system, would be covered by his capital. He stayed by her side, listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitors, a sound that, for a moment, replaced the frantic beating of his own heart. When Helena arrived an hour later, her face streaming with tears and her body trembling with fear, she found him sitting beside the bed, holding Sophia's hand, who was now sleeping more peacefully. He didn't give orders. He didn't call his private doctors. He didn't act like the magnate he was. He simply stood up, looked at the terrified mother, and held her hand too, uniting the three in a circle of silence and shared concern. In that instant, in the noisy hallway of a public hospital, Arthur Drummond's steel mask didn't just crack, it shattered. And for the first time in a long time, the man behind the fortune allowed himself to be seen. The next day dawned with a deceptive calm. Sophia's fever had broken during the night, and the girl, though still weak, was more alert, scribbling in a notebook Arthur had sent for. The hospital experience had fundamentally changed the dynamic between him and Helena. Her distrust had given way to contained gratitude, and his formal distance had dissolved into genuine concern. They were now two parents, united by love for the same child, a simple and powerful truth that transcended the abyssal differences in their lives and net worths. Arthur spent the morning resolving Sophia's discharge issues, talking to the doctors, ensuring she had the best follow-up care. Returning home late that afternoon, he found Elvira waiting for him in the living room. The housekeeper, normally so serene and discreet, had an expression of urgency on her face. In her hands, she held a large envelope yellowed with age. "Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice low and trembling, "I need to confess something to you. I kept this out of fear. Fear that the house would collapse if I showed it before." Arthur took the envelope, his heart pounding against his ribs. He opened it with careful hands. Inside was a tangle of memories that hit him with the force of a wave. The first item was a drawing, a child's scribble of a curly-haired girl holding a flower, unmistakably done by little Clara's hand. Alongside it, a note written in his ex-wife's hurried script, to remember our miracle, lest we ever forget what we went through to have her here. But it was the following objects that made the air rush from his lungs. 2 maternity identification wristbands, both bearing the name Clara Drummond. They were identical, except for one crucial detail. The recorded times of birth had a difference of almost 6 hours. One marked 2:15 a.m., the other 8:30 a.m. Why would there be 2 wristbands with such distinct times? The question hung in the air, laden with terrible implications. And then, at the bottom of the envelope, the final blow, an old night visitor's badge, with the faded photo of a young, smiling nurse. The name printed below the photo was Beatrice Almeida, the same Beatrice who had vanished. Arthur felt dizzy, as if the solid ground of his reality had turned to quicksand. The housekeeper, seeing his state of shock, explained with a catch in her voice, "Your wife gave me this envelope the day she was discharged. She was strange, agitated. She said it was insurance for Clara's future and asked me to hold it. After what happened, I was afraid to look, afraid of what it might mean. Forgive me, sir." But Arthur felt no anger, only an overwhelming coldness. He grabbed his phone and accessed Clara's birth certificate, which he kept in a digital file. The official time recorded at the registry did not match either of the wristband times. It was a third, completely different time. In that moment, the hypothesis that haunted him shifted, becoming even more monstrous. Perhaps the child he mourned and buried never left the hospital the way he believed. Or worse, perhaps she had left, but for another lap, another destiny, while a tragedy was staged to cover up the swap. The truth was not in a tomb. It was in that envelope. The envelope on the mahogany table looked like an artifact from a life that wasn't his. Arthur felt as if the last decade of his existence had been built on a well-told lie. A silent agreement of which he was the last person to know. The grief for Clara's loss now mixed with a new and terrible emotion, doubt. Every memory, every photograph, every celebrated birthday was now tinged with poisonous uncertainty. Pressed by the gravity of the discovery and the veiled threat from his cousin Richard, he knew he could no longer act alone. The family lawyer, Mr. Bastos, a man whose loyalty was to the Drummond wealth and not to any specific family member, called an emergency meeting. The chosen location was the 30th floor of the conglomerate's headquarters, a fortress of glass, granite, and expensive silence, designed to intimidate and assert power. Arthur entered the boardroom, feeling like a stranger in his own kingdom. Lydia and Richard were already there, their faces like plaster masks, their calculated concern barely concealing the greed in their eyes. Mr. Bastos opened the meeting with the coldness of a surgeon. "Arthur, we are here as a family and as a board. We understand you are undergoing a period of great emotional stress. But your recent actions are jeopardizing the stability of our businesses. We need clarity, facts." Arthur laid the contents of the envelope on the polished table. The drawing, the 2 wristbands, Beatrice's badge. He narrated the facts without emotion, his voice firm, contrasting with the storm in his chest. The reaction was not one of shock or empathy, but of strategic calculation. Richard picked up one of the wristbands as if analyzing a financial asset. "This is complicated. If this story leaks, our stock will plummet. The press would devour us." Lydia, pale, intervened, her voice sharp as broken glass. "The Drummond inheritance is a legacy of strength, not a maternity scandal. We need to resolve this, fast and definitively." Their solution was exactly what Arthur feared. Mr. Bastos, with Lydia and Richard's assent, proposed the most brutal and direct path. Seek a court order for the exhumation of Clara's body and a broad DNA test involving Sophia. "It's the only way to gain legal certainty and silence any future speculation," the lawyer concluded, as if discussing a corporate merger. Arthur felt his blood run cold. They wanted to turn his daughter's memory and an innocent girl's life into a public spectacle to protect their investments. "No," he said, the word echoing in the silent room. "I will not do that. I will not put Sophia in the middle of a circus." He proposed his alternative, an indirect genetic analysis using materials of Clara he had kept: a baby tooth, a lock of hair from her first haircut, and a sample from Sophia obtained discreetly and with Helena's consent. "It's slower, but it's humane," he argued. Richard laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Humane? Arthur, we're talking about billions. You've become soft." Lydia stood up, her face tight with fury. "Soft and irresponsible. Our image is at stake." In that moment of maximum tension, the heavy boardroom door opened. It was Elvira, the housekeeper, her face impassive, but her eyes flashing with defiance. And holding her hand was Sophia. She looked at the angry faces and, without saying a word, held up a drawing she had made that morning. A large golden star gently touching two hands, one big and one small. The room, with all its power and wealth, held its breath. The silence that fell over the boardroom was heavier than the granite table. Sophia's drawing, a gesture of pure innocence, acted as a mirror, reflecting the ugliness of the discussion taking place. Richard recoiled in his chair. Lydia averted her gaze. And even Mr. Bastos seemed momentarily speechless. Arthur looked at the girl, at her large, confident eyes, and then at the drawing of the star touching the two hands. In that instant, the choice that had previously seemed a complex dilemma between business and heart became absurdly simple. He knelt in front of Sophia, ignoring the shocked stares of his family. "That's a beautiful drawing," he said, his voice choked. "Thank you for bringing it." He stood up and faced the others. The final decision forged in the fire of that moment. "My answer remains no, and if I have to lose what I built to protect this child, so be it. I will not fail to protect someone I should have protected again." The declaration sounded like a sentence. It was a rejection not only of their proposal, but of the code of conduct that governed the Drummond clan, where assets always came before people. Arthur's decision unleashed an avalanche of consequences, swift and brutal. The conglomerate, now under Richard's effective control and with Lydia's support, moved to isolate him. His corporate credit cards were cut, his access to company systems frozen. The threat of separating him from his own surname, of stripping him of his rights to the inheritance, hung in the air, a weapon pointed at his head. Longtime friends, business partners who had profited millions from his investments, now didn't return his calls. He became, overnight, a pariah in his own world. The war was not limited to the corridors of power. An anonymous note, likely leaked by Richard, reached a sensationalist tabloid. Within days, photographers with long lenses began to lurk around Sophia's daycare. Helena called Arthur, her voice panicked. "There are strange men taking photos of the children. The other parents are afraid. What is happening?" Arthur felt a wave of fury and helplessness. His fight for truth was endangering the only person he wanted to protect. He used what remained of his influence and a considerable part of his personal capital to hire a discreet security team. not for himself, but to guard the school and Helena's house, ensuring no one approached him properly. Meanwhile, the adoptive mother, a woman who only wanted peace, found herself at the center of a hurricane. Neighbors started asking questions, looking at her differently. At work, her boss called her in for a conversation, mentioning rumors and concern about the company's image. The Drummond conglomerate was an octopus with tentacles across the city, and they were beginning to squeeze. The audit at the public hospital, which Arthur had managed to initiate through a contact at the Department of Health, also met resistance. The administration, likely pressured by external forces, refused to release any documents without a clear court order. Stalling the investigation, every step forward seemed to cost a piece of his old life. Every small victory came with a bitter price. The city's stifling heat seemed to reflect the pressure suffocating him, and the thin drizzle that marked his first encounter with Sophia seemed like a memory of a simpler time, of a purer pain. Amidst the relentless siege, small slivers of light began to appear, coming from the most unexpected places. The city, which was once just the backdrop for his business, became the chessboard of his investigation. The neighborhood park, with its smell of popcorn and the distant sound of music, which had once been a strange place for Arthur, turned into a refuge. It was there, sitting on a concrete bench while Sophia played on the slide under Helena's watchful eye, that he found the strength to continue. But the park also became the scene of unwanted surveillance, and the need for discretion molded every meeting. The bureaucracy of the registry office, where he spent hours trying to trace Clara's birth record, demanded a persistence that no stock market negotiation had ever required. The line at the public health clinic, where he accompanied Helena for Sophia's routine checkup, taught him a patience he didn't know he possessed. It was in this environment, far from the aseptic boardrooms, that the truth began to emerge. A former hospital cleaning lady, a woman named Mrs. Lourdes, sought out Helena after seeing one of the malicious photos in the paper. She recognized the face of Beatrice, the nurse on the badge, and told a story that had haunted her for years. "I remember that girl," Miss Lourdes said softly, sitting in Helena's simple kitchen. "She was always nervous, looking over her shoulder. The night Mr. Drummond's daughter was born, I saw her in the hall near the archive room. She was with a man in a suit, looking frightened. After that, I never saw her again." The description gave Arthur a new thread to pull: the hospital's dead archives. Using a private investigator, a discreet and efficient man he paid from his personal funds, Arthur gained access to a crucial piece of information. Due to a security system overhaul at the hospital at the time, the video files from a side camera, which covered the archive room hallway, were never migrated to the main server. They were forgotten on an old hard drive stored in a warehouse. Obtaining that hard drive became Arthur's new obsession. Meanwhile, the pressure on Jonah, the paramedic, increased. He was approached by a legal representative of the Drummond conglomerate who offered him a significant sum of money to sign a declaration denying the conversation he had with Arthur. Jonah, terrified, called Arthur. "They're trying to buy me. Silence me. What do I do?" Arthur calmed him, guaranteeing him protection and asking him only to buy time. The siege was closing, but so were the pieces of the puzzle. Another revelation came from an internal source in Arthur's company IT department. A young analyst, loyal to the former boss, discovered a spreadsheet detailing budget deviations on an old server. In it, there were recurrent and hefty payments to the Genesis Institute, categorized as donations for research projects, but without any corresponding report. And in a hidden tab of the spreadsheet, a list of hospital supplies donated to partner institutions. This list included the delivery of an entire batch of maternity identification wristbands to the hospital where Clara was born, exactly the week of the birth. The wristbands from the envelope, the deviation spreadsheet, the forgotten video file, and the cleaning lady's testimony. They were breadcrumbs, but together they formed a path leading directly to a dark and structured truth. A truth that his family's gold and assets were desperately trying to keep buried. With every new discovery, Arthur's internal conflict deepened. The shame of not having been a present father, of having delegated the most intimate details of his daughter's arrival to lawyers and assistants, now consumed him. The fear of being seen as soft, which once dictated his actions, was replaced by a much greater dread of failing again the child who depended on him. The old Arthur would have used his power and wealth to force the situation, to buy shortcuts and silence. The new Arthur, shaped by the public health clinic lines and Sophia's drawings of stars, knew that the only way to win that war was by fighting with the weapons his family despised: truth and integrity. The struggle for each piece of evidence was a battle in itself. To obtain ethical clearance for the indirect genetic analysis, he had to expose himself, presenting his case to a bioethics committee, waiving his privacy, and the victory came at a high cost. As soon as the authorization was granted, the news leaked to the press, this time with technical details that could only have come from someone inside the process. The tabloid published the headline, "Magnate Questions Paternity. May exhume daughter." The result was immediate and devastating. Sophia's daycare, bombarded by reporters and curiosity seekers, had to suspend activities for safety, leaving dozens of community families without childcare. Helena, seeing the chaos, nearly gave up. "Look what we're causing, Arthur," she said, weeping. "This isn't fair to Sophia or anyone." It took all of Arthur's calm and sincerity to convince her to proceed, promising to create a solution for the other families and reinforcing that the truth was the only way to protect Sophia long-term. He kept his promise, renting a community space and hiring recreation staff to look after the children while the daycare was closed. A gesture that cost him a significant portion of his personal resources but solidified Helena's trust. At the same time, the subplot of his family thickened. Elvira, the housekeeper, confessed her own anxiety to Arthur. She suspected that Lydia, the reputation-obsessed aunt, had undergone a procedure at the Genesis Institute years ago, something she had always vehemently denied. This would explain Lydia's panic in keeping the clinic's name out of any investigation. Richard, meanwhile, acted in the shadows. Arthur's investigator discovered that the ambitious cousin was making cryptocurrency transfers to an offshore account. The beneficiary was unknown, but the transfer pattern suggested an attempt to buy someone's silence. Could it be Beatrice? The missing nurse was the missing piece, the living link between the maternity ward and the clinic. Meanwhile, the private investigator finally managed to obtain the hard drive with the forgotten video file. In his improvised office, away from his family's eyes, Arthur watched the recording. The quality was grainy, the image black and white, but the content was undeniable. The side camera captured the archive room hallway in the early morning hours of Clara's birth. The image showed Beatrice, visibly nervous, meeting a man in a suit. They exchanged an envelope. Beatrice then entered a small storage room and emerged minutes later. Later, the same camera caught her near the nursery. Alone in the hallway, she leaned over one of the bassinets and with a quick, almost imperceptible movement, switched a baby's identification wristband. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. It was the proof, the visual evidence of the swap. It was no longer a hypothesis, a suspicion. It was a fact recorded on a hard drive. The truth, cold and irrefutable, was now in his hands. With the video in hand and the result of the indirect genetic analysis about to be revealed, Arthur knew the final confrontation was inevitable. He could no longer fight this war in the shadows. He needed a neutral arena, where facts could speak louder than money and influence. His personal lawyer, a man of integrity whom he hired after breaking with Mr. Bastos, suggested presenting the evidence to an ethical committee of the State Medical Board in a formal hearing. It would be a way to validate the evidence before taking it to court, creating an official and unquestionable record. The hearing was scheduled for a simple auditorium at a university hospital, an environment of learning and science. Far from the intimidating luxury of the corporate world, Arthur invited his family not as an affront, but as one last chance for them to hear the truth unfiltered. Lydia and Richard attended, accompanied by Mr. Bastos, their faces masks of contempt and disdain, confident that this was just the final desperate act of an emotionally troubled man. Helena was also there, seated next to Arthur. She trembled, but her hand held his with surprising firmness. Sophia remained with Elvira, protected from it all. The session began. A forensic geneticist, a white-haired man with a measured voice, presented the analysis report. He explained the process, the comparison of Clara's genetic material, obtained from the baby tooth and hair lock, with a saliva sample from Arthur and another from Sophia, collected with Helena's consent. The room held its breath when the final slide appeared on the screen. The analysis indicates unequivocal compatibility, the geneticist said. The probability of Arthur Drummond being the biological father of the girl known as Sophia is 99.9999%. A murmur swept through the auditorium. Lydia turned waxen pale. Richard clenched his fists on the table. Mr. Bastos scribbled furiously on his notepad. Before they could recover from the shock, Arthur's lawyer requested the floor and presented the second piece of evidence, the video file. The large auditorium screen, previously displaying DNA charts, now showed the grainy image of the hospital corridor. Silence was absolute, as everyone watched the scene of the nurse Beatrice swapping the baby's wristband. The movement, which had seemed quick and subtle, now in slow motion, was a clear and devastating confession. The image froze on Beatrice's frightened face. In that moment, the Drummond conglomerate, through its press office, fired off an official statement to all attending journalists, a desperate maneuver to control the narrative. The note spoke of malicious interpretations of low-quality images and non-conclusive genetic tests performed under emotional duress. But it was too late. The truth was exposed, raw and undeniable. Amidst the chaos of vibrating cell phones and shocked whispers, Helena turned to Arthur, her eyes full of tears, fear, and a silent question. What happens now? He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. This was the moment of greatest tension in his life, the moment he would have to make the choice that would define not only Sophia's future, but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his days. He stood up, walked to the podium, and the whole world seemed to stop to hear what he had to say. Arthur's voice, when it finally sounded in the silence of the auditorium, was not that of a billionaire declaring victory, nor of a victim seeking revenge. It was the voice of a father, stripped of artifice, loaded with a regret that was almost palpable. For many years, he began, looking not at the judges or the press, but at Helena. I lived a life of certainties, the certainty that money buys solutions, that influence protects, and that pain can be managed with distance. Today, I know I was wrong about all of them. He turned to the committee. The evidence you have seen is irrefutable, but the truth they tell is not just about a baby swap. It's about a system that allows the powerful to correct family trajectories, as they cynically call it, erasing lives and bonds to maintain appearances. A system that, by omission, I was part of. He paused, and the weight of the confession hung in the air. I assume my responsibility for not asking the right questions at the time, for settling for the efficiency of a process that was, in fact, a cover-up, for prioritizing my business and my comfort over my most basic duty as a father. His gaze then fixed on Lydia and Richard, who stared back, stunned. You were worried about the family image, about the inheritance, about the wealth. But what is a legacy without truth? It is just an empty building, a pile of soulless stocks. Finally, he addressed the question everyone in the room was asking. This revelation does not change my position. I did not come here to claim possession of a child. Sophia's mother is the woman sitting there, he said, pointing to Helena, who was quietly sobbing. Helena loved her, healed her, raised her. She is the mother Sophia knows and needs. I do not want to take my daughter from the home where she was loved. I want to honor the memory of the child I lost by giving the one who lives the right to have two hands to sustain her, not two sides warring over her. The declaration was a final blow to his family's strategy. He was not fighting for assets or a surname. He was fighting for the right to love and protect without destroying what already existed. The hearing ended in an uproar, but Arthur and Helena left the premises through a side exit, shielded from the chaos by the clarity of their decision. In the days that followed, the main conflicts began to resolve, not with the swiftness of a verdict, but with the inevitable weight of truth. The Genesis Institute was shut down, and a federal investigation was opened, revealing a network of manipulations that shocked the nation. Lydia, exposed and humiliated, withdrew from public life, her obsession with reputation finally destroyed by a scandal she herself had tried to suppress. Richard, facing accusations of obstruction of justice and bribery for attempting to buy Jonah's silence and funding Beatrice's escape, was forced to resign from all his positions in the conglomerate. The nurse, Beatrice, was located in a neighboring country and agreed to collaborate with authorities in exchange for protection, confessing to having been coerced by the clinic's management. The Drummond conglomerate, shaken to its foundations, underwent a drastic restructuring. Arthur, using his position as majority shareholder, removed the old board members and initiated a process of transparency, creating a foundation to help victims of similar crimes, an act of reparation worth more than any dividend. The housekeeper, Elvira, and the paramedic, Jonah, free from pressure and fear, could finally breathe a sigh of relief, their consciences at peace. The narrative arcs were closing, not with fairy tale happy endings, but with the justice and dignity that real life allows. A month later, the air in New York was clean, washed by a summer rain that gave way to a vibrant blue sky. The drizzle that initiated Arthur's journey seemed to belong to another life, to another man. He and Helena walked side by side down the pathway of Greenwood Cemetery, no longer strangers united by inexplicable grief, but partners in a new and complex family architecture. Between them, skipping and humming a childish tune, was Sophia, the girl, now aware of her story in a simple, age-appropriate way, carried a single red rose in one hand and a white daisy in the other. She did not see the tombstone as a place of sadness, but as the garden of her star sister. They arrived at the white marble tomb. The sight was different. Arthur had the cold, formal inscription removed and replaced it with a simple phrase, "Clara, a star that shines in another sky." Sophia approached, and with Helena's help, placed the two flowers together in a small vase, the rose and the daisy touching, a symbol of the union of their two worlds. Arthur observed the scene, his heart squeezed by a mix of longing and overwhelming gratitude. He removed the luxury watch from his wrist, a solid gold piece that had belonged to his father and for years had marked his time in meetings, mergers, and acquisitions. It was a symbol of the power, control, and wealth that had nearly blinded him to what truly mattered. With a solemn gesture, he placed it on the cold stone of the headstone, like a soldier laying down his arms at the end of a long war. It was his final surrender to guilt, to the tyranny of lost time. He leaned in and whispered, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. "I arrived late, my angel, but I arrived." In that instant, the distant city noise seemed to diminish, muffled by the peace of that moment. There was no easy ending. The future would bring shared custody agreements, adjustments, therapy to help Sophia navigate her complex identity, and the inevitable sidelong glances from society. The corporate family would never forgive him, and the press would still publish sporadic notes about the Drummond scandal, but a new, non-negotiable rule had been established in their universe. The truth, even when it hurts, is the only thing that cannot be bought. And from it, family ceased to be a document, a facade, or a bank account, to become a daily choice, an act of love and construction. As they turned to leave, Sophia took Arthur's hand with a naturalness that filled every void in his chest. "Are we getting ice cream?" she asked, tilting her head in that way that was hers alone, but which would forever remind him of another face. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't displayed in years. "We are," he replied, also taking Helena's hand. The three walked away, their shadows lengthening in the afternoon sun, leaving behind the marble, the flowers, and the gold watch. They were not a perfect family, nor a traditional one. They were a real family, forged in pain, courage, and the discovery that the greatest wealth is not in the assets accumulated, but in the bonds that refuse to break. The journey had been devastating, but the final destination was a place of hope where justice and affection could, at last, breathe together.